At 9:42 a.m. on June 19, 1944, Major Robert Morton Neiman crouched inside his M4 Sherman on Saipan, watching Japanese gunners adjust their aim toward his company, advancing across open ground toward fortified positions 200 yards ahead. 32 years old, commander of C Company, 4th Tank Battalion, 1 Navy Cross already earned. The Japanese had positioned at least 12 75mm anti-tank guns in concrete bunkers, covering the approach to the ridge, supported by heavy mortars in machine gun nests dug into the volcanic rock. Neiman's Sherman lurched forward with 11 other tanks from his company. The heat inside the turret was suffocating, over 100 degrees. His loader was already soaked through his uniform. They'd made it 70 yards when a massive impact threw Neen against the turret wall. Large caliber gun, direct hit. The engine compartment filled with thick black smoke. His crew bailed out through the hatches as Japanese machine guns rad the hull. Neiman ran 40 yards to the second tank in his platoon and climbed through the commander's hatch, while bullets sparked off the armor around him. His new tank advanced another 30 yards before the left track exploded. Landmine. The Sherman pivoted hard right, throwing Neiman into the gun breech hard enough to crack 2 ribs. His driver fought the controls, but the track was gone. 70-pound links scattered across the volcanic ash. They were stuck, sitting target. Neen ordered the crew out and sprinted under mortar fire to a 3rd Sherman, idling 20 yards back. He took command and pushed forward. This time, they penetrated the Japanese positions. His gunner destroyed 2 machine gun bunkers and a mortar pit. The attack succeeded, but the cost was brutal. By nightfall, C Company had lost 6 Shermans, 14 tankers killed or wounded, and this was just 1 day of fighting on Saipan. The 4th Marine Division had landed on the island 4 days earlier with 68 tanks. Within a week, Japanese mines and anti-tank guns had knocked out 23 of them. Nearly 1/3 of the division's armor strength gone. Neiman studied the pattern over the following days. The mines were everywhere. Japanese engineers had seeded the approaches to every defensive position with anti-tank mines, anti-personnel mines, and improvised explosives made from aircraft bombs. Marine combat engineers tried to clear paths with metal detectors, but they worked slowly under fire, and there were never enough of them. Tanks frequently outran the cleared lanes and hit mines that immobilized or destroyed them. The 4th Tank Battalion needed a way to clear mines faster. Neiman had read about British mine flail tanks in an Armored Force Journal article that reached Maui months earlier. The British used rotating chains to detonate mines ahead of the vehicle. Scorpion and crab designs, but the Marines didn't have any. The British equipment was all in Europe supporting Normandy operations. The Pacific got hand-me-downs and whatever the Army didn't want. If you want to see how Neiman solved this problem with scrap metal and marine ingenuity, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories with more people. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Neiman. After Saipan, the 4th Marine Division moved to Maui for rest and refit. Late 1944, the division would assault another Japanese-held island. Soon intelligence pointed to Ioima. Reports said the Japanese were fortifying it heavily. That meant more minefields, more dead Marines. Neen walked through the 4th Tank Battalion motor pool on Maui in November. Rows of Shermans sat under camouflage netting being serviced. Mechanics worked on transmissions and suspensions damaged in the fighting. At the far end of the lot sat a beat-up M4A2 dozer tank named Joker. It had taken damage on Saipan and been pulled from service. The Marine Corps was switching to the newer gasoline-powered M4A3 model. Anyway, the old diesel Sherman was headed for the scrap heap. Neiman stood looking at that broken dozer tank. Then he looked at the truck park where maintenance crews were stripping parts from damaged vehicles. And he had an idea that would either save hundreds of Marines or get him laughed out of the battalion. Neiman called a meeting with his officers and senior NCOs the next morning in the company tent. He spread out a rough sketch on the table, showing a Sherman with a rotating drum mounted on the front. Chains would hang from the drum and beat the ground ahead of the tank. When the chains hit a mine, it would detonate safely away from the vehicle. His officers studied the drawing. Some looked skeptical, others intrigued. Lieutenant Bob Reed, his executive officer, pointed out the obvious problem. How would they power the rotating mechanism? A tank engine drives the tracks. Everything else runs off batteries or manual operation. Nian said they would figure it out as they went. He needed volunteers who weren't afraid to cut holes in government property and weld things that weren't in any technical manual. Gunnery Sergeant Sam Johnston stepped forward without hesitation. He was the battalion's best mechanic, been working on tanks since 1941, served with the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal, where he kept Shermans running in conditions that should have destroyed them. Johnston said he could make it work if they gave him Staff Sergeant Ray Shaw and free access to the vehicle graveyard. Shaw was the chief maintenance NCO. Between them, they'd rebuilt dozens of damaged Shermans from parts scavenged off total losses. Neiman gave them authorization and told them to requisition whatever they needed. Johnston and Shaw spent 2 days walking through piles of wrecked vehicles, looking for the right components. They needed something that could rotate under power and take a beating. Aircraft parts were too delicate, tank parts too heavy. They found what they needed on the 3rd day. A destroyed 2.5-ton truck had a rear axle and differential still intact. The axle was about 6 feet long. The differential in the middle would allow it to rotate freely. Perfect. They pulled it off the truck frame with a crane and hauled it to the motor pool. The plan took shape over the next week. Weld a heavy steel frame to the front of the Joker where the dozer blade hydraulics used to attach. Mount the truck axle horizontally at the end of the frame. The differential in the middle would become the rotation point. Attach chains to the axle at intervals. When the axle spun at high speed, the chains would whip around and beat the ground, detonating any mines buried there. But power remained the problem. They needed to connect the tank's drive system to the external flail mechanism. Johnston found a solution in a wrecked Jeep. He salvaged the transmission, small enough to fit inside the Sherman's hull, tough enough to handle the load. He did something that would have gotten him court-martialed under normal circumstances. He cut a hole through the Sherman's frontal armor just left of the bow machine gun position, about 4 inches in diameter. He ran a drive shaft from inside the tank through that hole to the differential on the flail frame. Inside the tank, he connected the drive shaft to the Jeep transmission, which he bolted to the floor and meshed with the Sherman's own drivetrain through a series of gears and belts. The bow gunner would control everything: a lever to engage or disengage the flail, another to control rotation speed. The hydraulic controls from the old dozer blade would raise or lower the entire assembly. The 127th Naval Construction Battalion was stationed on Maui, CBS. They had welding equipment and skilled metalworkers who could fabricate complex structures. Nian explained what he needed, and they agreed to help. This wasn't official, just Marines helping Marines. The work took 3 weeks, and by early December, the vehicle sat in the motor pool looking like nothing anyone had ever seen before. A Sherman tank with a truck axle sticking out the front like a medieval weapon. Heavy chains hung from the axle, each about 3 feet long. The whole contraption could tilt up and down using the hydraulic ram. Crude welds covered the frame. Fixed steel plates encased the differential housing, though that armor would be added later after the first test revealed its necessity. Johnston climbed into the bow gunner position and pest-fired the mechanism in the motor pool. He engaged the drive shaft. The Jeep transmission caught. Power flowed through the shaft to the differential. The truck axle began to rotate slowly at first, then faster. The chains lifted off the ground as centrifugal force took over. They whipped around in a blur. The sound was incredible. Metal chains cutting through air at high speed, creating a roar that brought mechanics running from other parts of the motor pool. Johnston increased the speed. The chains moved faster. He decreased it. They slowed down. He raised the assembly. The chains lifted higher. He lowered it. The chains touched the ground and threw dirt and rocks everywhere as they spun. The control system worked perfectly, but nobody knew if it would actually survive contact with real mines. Explosive force might shred the chains. Shrapnel might destroy the differential. The whole thing might just blow apart. They needed a live test, and that meant laying an actual minefield and driving through it. Division commanders authorized the test in mid-December. This was unusual. Senior officers didn't normally approve deliberate mine detonations on training grounds, but the potential value was too high to ignore. If this worked, it could save lives on Uwima. Marine engineers laid the test minefield on an empty stretch of ground half a mile from the motor pool. They buried Japanese anti-tank mines captured on Saipan. Type 93 mines, ceramic cases filled with 22 pounds of explosive, enough to blow the track off a Sherman and potentially kill the crew. The engineers placed them at varying depths, some shallow, some deep, some in clusters, just like Japanese defenders would position them in actual combat, 30 to 40 yards of deadly ground. Niemann gathered his officers to watch. Word had spread through the battalion that something big was happening. Tankers showed up, mechanics, infantry marines from other units. About 100 men formed a loose perimeter around the test site, staying well back from the minefield. The Joker sat at the edge of the danger area, engine running. Johnston in the bow gunner position, ready to control the flail. Another experienced driver at the controls. Niemann stood 50 yards away watching. This would either validate 3 weeks of work or prove the whole concept was impossible. Johnston engaged the mechanism. The truck axle spun up to speed. The chains became a blur. The roar drowned out everything else. The driver released the brake and eased the Sherman forward at walking pace, about 2 miles per hour. The spinning chains hit the ground ahead of the tank. Dirt exploded upward. The chains were digging furrows in the earth, beating the ground with tremendous force. Then the first mine detonated. The explosion was massive. Debris flew 50 feet in the air. Smoke and dust obscured the tank. For a moment, nobody could see what had happened. Then the Sherman emerged from the clouds, still moving forward. The chains were still spinning. The mechanism was intact. Another explosion, then another. The flail was finding every mine in its path and triggering them safely ahead of the vehicle. The watching Marines stood transfixed as the improvised weapon performed exactly as designed. The Sherman crawled forward through continuous explosions. Each detonation threw up clouds of volcanic ash and rock fragments. The noise was deafening even at 50 yards distance. Marines watching from the perimeter saw the tank disappear completely into the smoke and dust. Only the sound of the engine and the roar of the spinning chains indicated it was still moving. 30 yards into the minefield, 35 yards. Explosions rippled along the path as the flail found mine after mine, 40 yards. The tank emerged on the far side. The driver stopped and Johnston shut down the mechanism. The chains wound down and hung motionless. The sudden silence was almost shocking after the sustained violence of the test. Marines rushed forward to inspect the vehicle. The tank was covered in dirt and scorch marks, but appeared intact. The chains showed some deformation, but were still attached to the axle. The frame held solid. Johnston climbed out and walked around to examine the differential housing. That's when they found the problem. Shrapnel from one of the mine explosions had penetrated the underside of the differential casing. A jagged piece of metal about the size of a man's thumb had punched through the thin steel. The differential itself wasn't damaged. The gears still turned freely, but the vulnerability was obvious and unacceptable. In combat, a lucky fragment in the wrong place could disable the entire mechanism. Shaw and the CBS went to work that afternoon. They didn't wait for authorization or approval, just started cutting steel plate and firing up welding torches. Over the next 2 days, they encased the differential housing in thick armor, quarter-inch steel plates welded together to form a protective shell around the vulnerable components. The welds were crude but strong. When they finished, the differential housing looked like an armored box bolted to the front of the tank. They ran a second test 4 days later. Another minefield, same setup. This time, when the tank completed its run and Johnston inspected the differential housing, the added armor showed multiple impact marks, but zero penetrations. The shrapnel had bounced off. The modification had solved the vulnerability. Niemann submitted a written report to battalion headquarters detailing both tests. The vehicle had cleared 2 40-yard minefields in less than 5 minutes total. No casualties, no engineers exposed to enemy fire. The flail absorbed all the explosive force. Battalion commander approved moving forward. Division wanted to see it. They scheduled a formal demonstration for late December. High-ranking officers from across the 4th Marine Division would attend. Infantry battalion commanders who would rely on tanks to support their assaults. Artillery officers, logistics staff, even some Army observers stationed on Maui. This would be the flail tank's chance to prove it wasn't just a successful experiment, but a combat-worthy weapon that deserved to go to Aoima. The demonstration was set for December 28th. Niemann spent the days leading up to it making sure everything was perfect. The chains were inspected and replaced where necessary. The drive system was tested repeatedly. The hydraulics checked and rechecked. Johnston practiced engaging and disengaging the mechanism until he could do it smoothly every time. The morning of December 28th arrived clear and warm. Niemann reached the demonstration site at 0700 to supervise final preparations. Chairs were set up for the visiting officers. The minefield was ready. The Joker sat waiting with a fresh coat of paint covering some of the worst scars from Saipan. Everything looked perfect except for one critical problem. Johnston was missing. And when Marines finally located him 30 minutes later, the gunnery sergeant who had built this entire mechanism was drunk as a skunk and in no condition to demonstrate anything to anyone. Niemann found Johnston in his tent, barely conscious. The gunnery sergeant had been drinking through the night and was completely incapacitated. No amount of coffee or cold water would get him functional in 30 minutes. Niemann had to find a replacement driver who could operate equipment he'd never touched before and demonstrated it to general officers in less than an hour. He grabbed the first qualified tank operator he could find, a corporal from a company who had driven Shermans since Roy Nemore. Niemann pulled him aside and gave him a 10-minute crash course on the flail controls, the engagement lever, the speed adjustment, how to raise and lower the assembly using the hydraulic controls. The corporal had good hands and learned fast, but he'd never actually operated the specific mechanism. The officers began arriving at 0745. 2 full colonels, 3 lieutenant colonels, a major general from 4th Marine Division headquarters, battalion commanders from infantry regiments, artillery officers who would provide fire support on Aoima, representatives from engineer battalions, about 30 senior officers total. They sat in the chairs arranged in front of the demonstration area. Some looked skeptical. Most just looked curious about what this scrap metal contraption was supposed to accomplish. Niemann walked to the front at 0800 sharp and gave his briefing. He explained the mine problem, showed statistics from Saipan. 23 tanks lost in the first week, many to mines. Engineers clearing paths at a rate of maybe 10 yards under fire. He pointed to the Joker and walked the officers through the modification, the truck axle, the chains, the drive system, the welded armor protecting the differential. He kept it factual, no overselling, just the engineering and the test results. Then he stepped back and let the demonstration begin. The replacement driver started the engine, engaged the flail mechanism. The truck axle spun up to speed with that distinctive roar. The chains became a blur. The Sherman moved forward into the prepared minefield at walking pace. Within seconds, the first mine detonated. The explosion was massive. Dirt and smoke erupted upward. Then another detonation, and another. The flail was triggering mines continuously as it advanced. The officers watched in silence as the tank disappeared into clouds of dust and explosive smoke. The sound of detonations rolled across the demonstration area. 40 seconds after entering the minefield, the Sherman emerged on the far side. The driver stopped and shut down the flail. The chains wound down. The mechanism was intact. Several officers stood and walked closer to inspect the vehicle. They examined the chains, looked at the differential housing with its welded armor showing fresh impact marks from shrapnel, asked questions about maintenance requirements and spare parts. The Major General from Division Headquarters spent 5 minutes studying the drive shaft connection through the frontal armor. When the inspection finished, the senior officers conferred briefly among themselves. Then the Major General turned to Neyman and asked how many of these vehicles could be ready by February. Neyman said they only had one. Building more would require authorization to modify additional tanks and access to more salvage parts. The general said he would provide both. Division approved immediate deployment of the existing flail tank. It would go to Iwo with C Company, 4th Tank Battalion. If it performed well in combat, more would be built. The assault date was set for February 19, 1945, 63 days away, and Neyman had just committed to leading this untested weapon into the most heavily fortified island in the Pacific. The 4th Marine Division spent January preparing for Iwo. Intelligence reports painted a grim picture. The island was 8 square miles of volcanic rock and ash. Mount Suribachi dominated the southern tip, 3 airfields under construction, and an estimated 21,000 Japanese defenders who had spent months fortifying every cave, every ridge, every approach. The Japanese commander was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. He had abandoned the traditional beach defense strategy that failed on other islands. Instead, he created a defense in depth. Bunkers and tunnels connected by miles of underground passages, interlocking fields of fire, artillery positions hidden in caves, and extensive minefields covering every avenue of approach. American planners expected casualties. 70,000 Marines would assault the island. 5th Amphibious Corps, 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, the largest marine operation in the Pacific, and every commander knew it would be brutal. Neyman's flail tank presented a unique logistical challenge. It was the only diesel-powered Sherman in the 4th Tank Battalion. Everything else had been converted to the newer M4A3 with Ford gasoline engines. That meant separate fuel supply, different maintenance requirements. The flail would need its own support. The tank was assigned to 2nd Platoon C Company, 4th Tank Battalion. Sergeant Rick Haydex would command it in combat. Haydex was an experienced tank commander who had fought on Saipan and Tinian. He understood the flail mechanism and had practiced with it during the final weeks on Maui. Johnston, now sober and focused, gave him detailed instruction on the controls and maintenance. The 4th Marine Division embarked from Maui in late January. LSTs and transport ships carried the men and equipment toward Iwo. The voyage took 3 weeks, with stops at any Saipan. The flail tank was secured in the hold of an LST alongside conventional Shermans from the battalion. February 19, 1945, D-Day. The pre-invasion bombardment began at 0640. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers pounded the island. Carrier aircraft struck targets inland. The barrage was supposed to neutralize Japanese defenses. It didn't. Kuribayashi had ordered his men to stay underground and wait for the Marines to land. The first wave hit the beaches at 900 hours. 2nd and 3rd Battalion's 28th Marines landed on the southern beaches below Mount Suribachi. 4th and 5th Marine Divisions hit beaches on the eastern shore. The volcanic ash was worse than anyone expected. Black sand that vehicles sank into. Some landing craft couldn't reach the shore. Marines had to wade through surf carrying heavy equipment. The 4th Tank Battalion began landing at 0930. Sherman after Sherman rolled off LST ramps into shallow water and turned toward the beach. Many bogged down immediately in the ash. Tracks spun uselessly. The volcanic sand was too fine, too soft. It couldn't support the weight of a 30-ton tank. Neyman's flail tank came ashore at 01015 with C Company Haydex in command. The Sherman made it through the surf, but struggled on the beach. The ash was 18 inches deep in places, like trying to drive through flour. The tank's weight caused it to sink, and the tracks couldn't find purchase. But the flail mechanism added weight to the front, which helped keep the bow from digging in too deep. By noon, 4th Tank Battalion had 23 Shermans ashore. 8 were stuck in the ash and being excavated by engineers. 15 were operational and moving inland. Japanese artillery began finding the range. Mortar rounds fell on the beaches. The flail tank pushed forward with other Shermans from C Company toward the first objective, Airfield Number 1, half a mile inland. And according to intelligence reports, surrounded by extensive minefields that would have to be crossed under fire. C Company pushed inland through the volcanic ash. The terrain was unlike anything the Marines had encountered before. Black sand that shifted under every step. No vegetation, no cover, just open ground rising gradually toward the airfield. Japanese defensive positions were invisible. Bunkers built into the ground, gun ports hidden behind rocks. Everything camouflaged to blend with the volcanic landscape. The advance was slow. Infantry moved ahead of the tanks, checking for obstacles. Engineers swept for mines with metal detectors. Every 100 yards took 15 minutes. Japanese fire intensified as they moved further from the beach. Mortar rounds, artillery, machine guns firing from concealed positions. Marines took casualties but kept moving. Haydex's flail tanks stayed with the lead elements of C Company. The mechanism hadn't been needed yet. No confirmed minefields, but everyone knew the Japanese had laid mines somewhere. Intelligence had been clear about that. The question was where. By 1400 hours, C Company had advanced 400 yards. Airfield Number 1 was visible ahead. A rough strip bulldozed across the volcanic ash by Japanese engineers. No aircraft. The Japanese had evacuated their planes before the invasion, but the airfield was strategically critical. American forces needed to secure it to prevent Japanese counterattacks and to establish their own forward positions. Haydex spotted a series of small flags planted in the ground about 50 yards ahead near the southern edge of the airfield. Red fabric on wooden stakes. They formed a rough line perpendicular to his avenue of advance. His training said flags marked obstacles, minefields, wire, trenches, something the Japanese wanted their own troops to avoid or be aware of. This looked like minefield markers. He radioed his platoon commander and requested permission to engage the flail mechanism. Clear a path through what appeared to be a mined area. Permission granted. Haydex told his bow gunner to prepare the flail. The bow gunner engaged the drive shaft. The truck axle began to spin. The chains lifted off the ground as they picked up speed. What Haydex didn't know was that those flags weren't minefield markers. They were range markers for Japanese heavy mortars, positioned in elevated but hidden positions 500 yards to the north. Kuribayashi's defenders had pre-registered fire on key terrain features. The flags helped mortar crews adjust their aim. When the flail tank moved toward those markers, Japanese observers immediately reported the target. The first mortar round landed 20 yards short. Haydex saw the explosion and ordered his driver to increase speed. Get through the suspected minefield fast. The second round landed 10 yards closer. The third round was a direct hit on the volcanic ash 5 feet in front of the tank. The explosion threw debris across the hall and cracked the driver's periscope. More rounds began falling in rapid succession. The Japanese had multiple mortar positions firing simultaneously, creating a barrage. Haydex ordered the driver to reverse, but the Sherman's tracks just spun in the soft ash. The weight of the flail mechanism on the front made the situation worse. The bow dug deeper into the volcanic sand. They were stuck under sustained mortar fire. The flail mechanism was still spinning, but the tank couldn't move forward or backward. Haydex shut down the flail to reduce weight on the bow. The driver gunned the engine. The tracks threw up huge clouds of black ash, but found no traction. Japanese mortars continued to bracket the immobilized Sherman. Fragments rang off the armor. The tank was taking hits, but the crew was still alive inside, and they had no way to get unstuck without help from other vehicles or engineers. The flail tank's first combat mission had lasted less than 30 minutes, and it was about to end in the volcanic ash of Uwima. Another Sherman from C Company moved up to help. The crew attached a tow cable and pulled Haydex's flail tank backward out of the soft ash. The extraction took 20 minutes under continuous mortar fire. Once freed, the flail tank withdrew to a more protected position behind a small ridge. The crew inspected the damage. Multiple fragment impacts on the hull and turret cracked periscope, but the tank was still operational. The flail mechanism was intact. That was the first and last time the improvised mine-clearing tank saw combat on Uwima. The volcanic ash made mobility nearly impossible for heavily loaded vehicles. The flail assembly added too much weight to the bow, and the Japanese had positioned most of their mines on higher ground, further inland, where the ash was even deeper. Engineers with metal detectors proved more effective in those conditions, despite the slower pace and higher casualty rate. The battle for Uwima lasted 36 days. American forces declared the island secure on March 26, 1945. Nearly 7,000 Marines died. Another 20,000 were wounded. Japanese casualties exceeded 98%. Only 216 of the original 21,000 defenders were captured alive. The rest died fighting or committed suicide rather than surrender. The Battle of Uwima produced 27 Medals of Honor, more than any other single battle in American military history. Admiral Chester Nimitz said that on Uwima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. Nimitz survived the battle. He continued to command tanks through the final months of the war, including occupation duty in North China. He received the Navy Cross for his actions on Saipan, where he switched tanks twice under fire and continued the attack. He left the Marine Corps in 1946 and built a successful career as a lumber retailer. He died in 2003 at age 91. The flail tank he built from salvage parts never achieved the combat success he hoped for, but the concept was sound. American forces built more mine flails for the planned invasion of Japan. Those operations were canceled after the atomic bombs ended the war. Modern mine-clearing vehicles still use rotating flails based on the same principle Nieman and his mechanics improvised in a motor pool on Maui. The 4th Tank Battalion lost 33 Shermans on Uwima, some to mines, most to Japanese anti-tank guns and artillery. But they accomplished their mission. They supported the infantry. They destroyed fortifications. They kept moving forward when every instinct said to stop. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about Marines who built tanks from junk, real ingenuity, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Major Robert Nieman and the thousands of Marines who fought on Uwima don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that.